On today's show, we have the Dr. Mariel Bouquet, who is the author of the new book, Break the Cycle, A Guide to Healing Intergenerational Trauma. This book was featured on Oprah's book pick on her IG page in January 2024. And let me tell you, I understand why. She's absolutely phenomenal. She's a clinical psychologist, identifies as Afro-Latina. She was trained at Columbia University, built community there. She was part of an integrated system of holistic healing, something which we all can benefit from. And she's the CEO of Break the Cycle of Trauma. Her mission is to reduce the recurrence of intergenerational adverse childhood experiences. Let's get into it today with Dr. Mariel. Dr. Mariel is in the house today on the show. I could not be more excited to have you here. Thank you so much. We are deeply, deeply honored. I want to say that I had seen you on another podcast a few months ago. It was a live that was on, I believe. And I said, who is this person? When I heard you talking and when I saw your bright energy, I started clicking. And I was able to very quickly find you on the internet. And I said, oh my goodness, have I been in a hole in the ground? Because you've been everywhere and you have become one of the leading experts on this topic that we're going to delve into today, intergenerational trauma. And your ability, when I read your book, Break the Cycle, which I have to hold up here because it is stunning. When I read this book, I stopped in my tracks the entire time. I mean, I had to pause and go back and read again and sit with it and breathe in the language and the energy of you and your ancestors who were coming through you. And I could feel my nervous system literally start to calm down just from doing these exercises that you share. So I'm jumping way ahead. And I want to start out with understanding this term that gets kind of thrown around a lot in pop psychology, trauma. But in terms of you are a clinical psychologist, in terms of from a psychological standpoint, what is trauma?
Hmm. It's a great starting point, and thank you for just leading us with so much grace and kindness. So, trauma itself is the long-standing emotional response, and one might even call it a coping mechanism in reference to having experienced some form of adversity. So it's really the ways in which our minds and even our bodies mechanize ways to keep us protected from the possibilities of that adversity happening again.
Mhm.
And what tends to happen is that we start to default to certain coping, very unconscious coping styles that are situated in our nervous system that then are kind of like program us and prime us for the possibilities of that traumatic experience or event happening again. So trauma itself is not necessarily the event, because multiple people can experience the same event and not come out with a trauma wound. Trauma instead is the emotional remnant and experience and coping that we've adopted in a very subconscious way in order to help us get through the original adversity and also help us to not necessarily have to undergo that adversity again. So it keeps us in a almost kind of like an alerted, hyper alerted threat response so as to safeguard us from the experience.
Yeah. So not necessarily going through an experience that is activating, that's upsetting, that is terrible for some people, like watching a death happen, for example,
Mm.
having a breakup. It's one of those things that can feel bad to us in terms of emotionally, but not necessarily program our nervous system in a way to be on high alert. Some people, it puts them on high alert. Their nervous system says, oh, I need to watch out for this event again or something similar. And other people, that nervous system kind of calms down and they're able to move through.
Yeah, yeah, and, so many factors are to be considered in where our nervous system tends to go because we could have suffered the loss of a parent 6 months ago and then a breakup today, and that breakup would have been so hard-hitting because it's now multiple losses within a 6-month period. Whereas someone who would have suffered a very similar kind of breakup would have probably been able to get through that process with more facility because they themselves don't have the layered experience of that other loss that came just 6 months prior.
Mhm, mhm. So your nervous system, when it has one right after the next, right after the next, right after the next, or even if it's not in a short period of time, if it's, multiple things that happen even over a long period of time, that can be something that gets, like you said, layered in the nervous system where it almost has a memory, doesn't quite forget that. And so it is on alert so that when something else happens, it gets activated. And so, how does that translate then into being passed down when you say intergenerational? The term intergenerational, I think of something being passed down from one body to
Mm.
the next or from one family to the next. How does trauma then become intergenerational trauma?
It happens at the intersection of our biology and our psychology. And what that means is that there is, like no other trauma or category of traumatic retention, this kind of trauma actually has a biological component that has a multitude of layers within it. But most notably, some of what we know is that there is an element that is situated in our genetic expressions. So when we have a parent, grandparent, great grandparent, distant ancestors that they themselves have had experiences of prolonged suffering and experiences of trauma retention in their minds and bodies, what that can actually do is that it can start appearing in their genetic expressions. And so that genetic encoding, once they conceive their own children, can get passed down as genetic messages that basically, for the sake of, kind of like having an understanding of what does that look like for us. Now we're just a cell that's been created, right, in the womb.
Mhm,
What does that mean? It means that we are likely to inherit genetic expressions that can make us a bit more tender than someone who perhaps doesn't have a history of families that have been in deep trauma. So, what happens beyond that is a lot of what we categorize as within our psychology, meaning that we could now be born into a home where there's some sort of chaos that's happening, or maybe there's like relational turbulence of some sort, or perhaps we're in a home environment that's a part of a community that experiences a lot of adversity. Or we go into the school system, and within the school system, there's adversity that's suffered. Maybe we were in a school system where a shooting happened, or we experienced bullying. And then fast forward, we get into that first relationship, second, third, and some of what's in that relationship also has some toxic elements that actually leave us really in a state of feeling really deeply wounded. And so I'm going through kind of almost kind of like the lifespan of all the things that can be possibilities of what happens. And any one of those things and many, many others could actually trigger those initial genetic expressions and vulnerabilities to then turn on or off in reference to what's happening in our world. But the thing that makes it intergenerational is that we had parents, grandparents, great grandparents, and so forth, who themselves were in states of trauma, translated biological material and biological messaging to us that created some sense of vulnerability that then got triggered forward. And then now trauma symptoms start surfacing in our lifetime, which makes it intergenerational.
it's as if I called it when I started reading your book, I was thinking of the term, the birds and the bees, right? It's like the modern birds and the bees. It's looking back and, I love the example that you share of that your grandmother carries all of her eggs when she's born, and in there is your mother or your father. as far as your biological mother or father. There's some programming that's already taken place. And then your mother's born and she has all of her eggs, but she's carried part of her grandmother. I mean, but a part of her mother is there. And because she's born with all of her eggs, you already are partially there and she's there. So there's 3 generations there already. And
Mhm.
so that's that intergenerational nervous system that you mentioned in your book, where that genetic encoding that's already happened in that nervous system is now being passed down biologically, not just
Mhm.
psychologically.
Yeah, the thing about the nervous system is that it it is very tender and sensitive to what happens in our environment. So we're already talking about the biological component here that means that we at one point in time existed as three bodies in one, three generations in one body. And that happened by way of when our grandmothers were pregnant at 5 months gestation, they had a little baby, an embryo within them, whether it was our mother or father. And that embryo actually, at 5 months, already carried the precursor sex cells that would have eventually developed into being the cells that would eventually become us, right? When our parents conceive us. So, what that's telling us is that we have three generations living in one body, meaning that whatever experiences were happening in our grandmother's environments, there could have been wars, there could have been domestic disputes, there could have been multiple losses that they had experienced and had to internalize very complex grief. And all of that is a part of what's then filtering stress hormones into their bloodstream and making it so that those very stress hormones are reaching their baby, the embryo, and eventually reaching that precursor sex cell, which would have been you or would eventually turn into you. So, when we're talking about the intergenerational nervous system, we kind of take it 2 generations back into an understanding of, oh, there have been stress markers and ways in which our little tiny bodies would have ingested the stressors that were happening 2 generations ago. And now, fast forward to now when we are already a baby outside of the womb, let's imagine that we have a multi generational home. It's still mom, grandmom, and you, right? And let's say we're just gonna fast forward to maybe like second grade. You're coming home and you flip through like this little like magazine, like let's say a scholastic magazine. You bring that home, you're like, Mom, look, I really want this. And mom has a really stressful day at work, but she also is aware of her own financial limitations, and that's causing added stress for her. And now you, the child, are asking her for something that's gonna stretch her further. So, what is happening in this moment? Your mother starts yelling because her stress response or her nervous system response has defaulted to fight. We have
Mhm.
fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which are the traditional nervous system responses that we have identified and understood. She's in fight mode, so she starts yelling at you and, yells all kinds of things and really unravels your own little tiny nervous system who resorts to fleeing. So you're in flight. You run to your room because you're so overwhelmed by the fact that your mother just lunged at you with really aggressive words. What happens then is that grandma comes out of her room and she says, Please stop yelling at that child, I beg of you. And so grandma is now in a fawn response. She's people pleasing her daughter, asking her for her to do anything in her power to please make the fighting stop. And so now you have 3 generations in one home who were previously coexisting in one body and
Mm.
ingesting the same stressors as one whole, like, um one almost kind of system that coexisted within itself that now is 3 humans that have been extracted from one another by way of birth, but are now collectively triggering one another. For our nervous system, language, we've always just applied one person. We've always just looked at it as just my nervous system, only my response. And we haven't really taken into consideration the fact that our nervous systems co-form and coexist in wombs, and then they get extracted and they become, programmed to each other,
Mhm.
especially in our infancy. So the intergenerational nervous system is multi-layered, but it is really a reflection of all these things.
I'm getting ready to have a therapy session right now. I have tears in my eyes, and that's okay. What you just described was almost exactly me in 2nd grade. Even 2nd grade, you said, because of course we have this synergy. We already decided that recently. It's literally that my parents have gone through terrible, terrible trauma when they were children. And I know that was already encoded in me when I was born because they were young, 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 5 years old for one, 7 years old for the other, experiencing really unexpected traumatic deaths, in their immediate families. And I know that when that happened to me in 2nd grade at 8 years old, when on the day that my 2 brothers passed unexpectedly, and I can see all of that, how that happened of I had a flee response. My mom had a fight response. My dad had a fawn response. And of course, my
Mm,
dad is not my grandmother. And, as far as a direct analogy to your story, and it all was at the same time. It was all at the same time.
mhm,
At the same time that I witnessed my brother's passing. So I have these visuals of that. But what's interesting
mm.
is that
Wow.
it's not just the one event of seeing, their bodies, but it's all the other things that were happening at the same time. And so even that in itself and within seconds became very layered in my nervous system. And
Mhm,
it's interesting because although I've done my really, really deep, deep healing on this and normally can talk about it so openly, hearing it from the standpoint of your example of how there can be all these different responses because of the way our systems are encoded. And also, the environmentally, what we've been taught is it goes to show that even with all the therapy and all the healing, there is still that activation that can happen, just that awareness of opening up of, ah, what I'm feeling coming up is just almost like a release of any kind of shame that can come up. It's almost like what I find so powerful about what you're sharing, Mariel, is that it helps externalize what has been happening to us. Like the mother who
mhm,
who yells, it's not that she's necessarily impatient, it's that her nervous system is likely activated. Do we have to take some ownership of that? Sure. But sometimes we don't even know what we're owning. And we don't even know
mhm,
what to own. It's like, "Oh,
mhm,
wait, I move through the world as a patient." That mother might move through the world in the example that you shared as a fairly patient person. But then when something is activating for her like that, then she goes into fight mode. And so that can be kind of like mess with your mind a little bit if you're thinking, "But wait,
mhm,
I am patient. I am a loving person. Why do I do this?" And what you shared, here in this story, but also obviously in the book, is I think very normalizing for us, but
mhm,
also helps remove our own pathology around it in terms of, oh, there's something that I'm doing that's wrong with me. And so that can help to empower. So, how does somebody then, at that point, having this knowledge, begin to move through intergenerational healing of that
mhm.
nervous system?
I'm so honored that you're so willing to share your humanity with me. And sometimes I've been speaking about this for so long and so fervently that I sometimes forget that I've had a similar response, to my own family. And what's been the driver for me has been also my inability to have encompassed enough compassion for my parents for everything that they've gone through, and only really, kind of lending myself to my own nervous system response in the moment in reference to what I see as the issue right in front of me, not considering the enormity of pain that they have had to carry for their entire lives. And what why I bring that up is because some of what I hope that the intergenerational healing could lead with is an element of compassion. Because when we are just focused on the situation, someone did not do the dishes, right? It could be anything. We forget that we're a living embodiment of our histories and our family's histories. And we forget that if the person that didn't do the dishes gets on the defense, that defense isn't just a defense that's situated, it's in the current event. It's not situational, it's generational. And I think that it offers us an opportunity to really humanize ourselves and humanize each other. Even with the difficult people in our lives, we can say, you know what? I can see the difficulties in how you show up in your pain, while also simultaneously being able to have some element of compassion for how you needed to default to that kind of defense mechanism in order to survive the life that you've had to undergo and the life that people before you have had to undergo and all of your emotional vulnerabilities that have been carried forward as a result. So for me, as it's interesting because as I wrote this book, I'm like, there's tangible tools. Let's get to the tools. Let's do some biological reprogramming. Let's do some mental reprogramming. Let's like really hone in on how our spirits are holding all of this pain. And recently, as I've been tasked with speaking like engagements, and have had to almost kind of compartmentalize my entire book into like one thing that I can leave folks with. It's like the one message. A lot of it has really come back to that element of compassion and or the element of hope. The idea that we can survive. The idea that we can live lives that are full and nurturing and are in the category of thriving, even when we've had these wounds that have been generational. I think you're a prime example, right? Like, just how you show up to the world, your gentleness, the fact that you're, a prominent and successful and vibrant business owner and you carry a lot of like your soul into your work. A person can look at the pains of the past and see your life and say, that's not possible for someone like her. It's too much pain there. And I'm almost kind of like, getting a little on the emotional kind of spectrum myself because I'm like, I think that people would say that about me too. And the thing about generational healing is that I hope that it can infuse hope in people to say, no, you can. And you can even heal on behalf of the people that couldn't, either because they didn't have the facility, the tools, the access, because they sometimes didn't even have the motivation. They were like, that's too hard. It's too hard. I don't
Mm.
want to do it.
Mhm.
And that's okay, but we can heal back on their behalf. I can heal the parts of me that I've inherited that are more captured in the things that were modeled by my parents and make a decision to no longer carry that forward. And that's healing that I do for me and for them
Mhm.
because they didn't have what I had. They actually created pathways for opportunities for me to be able to have those tools. So I'll
Yeah.
use that privilege. I call it the generational privilege of having the healing tools to be able to do the work, not just on my behalf, but on their behalf.
That is so true, and, from from a logistics standpoint, here's what I hear clients say all the time. They start going through the work, and then they become almost resentful to their parents or their family members who have not done the work, and remembering that generational privilege is paramount, like, especially in our like, I'm a Gen Xer, and our parents, my from my generation, our parents were the veteran generation or really, really early on baby boomers. They're right in there. And, we can talk about how women, for example, succumb to a man's desires kind of things in terms of like, keeping men comfortable. And
Mm.
I have to remind myself and clients and, friends when we're just talking about this, that women didn't have the same sense of safety socially that we do now, which is still a long ways to go. But in terms of, I could just start an LLC, right? I could just start a business and have it approved by the Secretary of State in 3 to 5 business days. And
Wow.
that's not that I
Mhm.
can do that now. And that is not something that my mother or many of our mothers could have just poofed and done back in the day, with the sense of security that I can do that now. There are
Mm.
supports in place environmentally for me now, and there are tons of barriers as well for us, but even more so for the generations before us, and not just our moms, um, our grandparents, and we could go on. It was when we say it was different times, we have to remember it was really different times, and the privileges that we have we have that oftentimes, particularly for you and I, right, with our parents immigrating here, it's something that they did not have, and they might not know just because we have the tools now to know how to go through that healing. They might not be there. They didn't have that. We didn't have therapy early on for them, for example. We didn't know, in, at least in, in many generations, they didn't have access um, to the supports that we had. But I'm wondering, in terms of being able to create connection with family members who have contributed to that trauma. Like in the story that I was just sharing about being in second grade, my parents contributed to the trauma. Unwittingly, they're human, they were in their 30s. They
Mhm.
had their own responses that, you know, came right up immediately for them when they got activated, and things were said and things came out, that were hurtful to me, and
Mhm.
created more of those layers. So for people who have had traumatic experiences that were caused by family members, how do people seek connection or create connection and belonging with those members?
It really is very nuanced and layered. But one of the things that I think you and I both know as being clinicians that is really essential for us to hone in on when it comes to a process of healing where resentment enters the picture is that we have to honor that emotion. We have to sit with it. We have to sit with the righteous rage of feeling frustrated, perhaps angry at the fact that healing couldn't happen before it reached us.
Mm,
That's it's valid, right? Like it hurts. It hurts in this very nuanced and layered way to have to sit with that understanding. And very often, I mean, I think it's really easy for us to point the finger back and say, "You didn't do the work. Now I'm hurting. Shame on you."
mhm,
But of course, as you and I both know, and if perhaps you know better than me, and within the concept of belonging and connection, is that that is a recipe for there to be fracturing that sometimes can even be irreparable. And we have to think of the fact that people that were in the boomer and up generations, they have had different ways in which they've had to cope with difficult circumstances that don't look anything like the rest of us. And even for us that are in these latter generations, we're nothing like these upcoming generations in terms
mhm,
of how they cope with circumstances that have been harmful. So we have to consider the fact that there are generational experiences of coping or like collective coping that happens generation to generation. And I believe that one such example is that for boomers, it has been socialized for them to avoid. They're very big avoiders. And it's not to shame or to pathologize that kind of coping. It's just to say this was the zeitgeist of the time. This was a way in which they were socialized to deal with. You just move on. You just move
mhm,
on. You let it be. You move on. You keep going, and you don't process.
mhm,
That wasn't the kind of way in which they would organize around things. And so when we're sitting here saying, "Hey, you know, show accountability for the ways that you showed up in a hurtful way." what's going to be the natural response to flee, to say, no, I don't remember that. That didn't happen, or I didn't do that, or right. And
Mhm.
it looks like an invalidation. And quite frankly, it would be. But in part, it's a coping mechanism of not being able to, or having the tools to actually sit with the responsibility of what the hurt that they would have caused. So, more often than not, pointing the fingers just builds walls and forges disconnection. It isn't helpful. In part, some of what we need to do, and I do offer this as a frame of reference within the latter part of the book, is we need to find ways to grieve the family that we wish we had. Anybody who has had some sort of connection and proximity and the capacity to hurt us, those individuals may very likely not absorb responsibility and represent that in their conversation with you. So, what are you likely to do? Sit in the pain and continue to, for the extent of your healing journey, fight them to assume responsibility, and then, which is really popular these days, cut them off
Mhm.
and cut off connection and cut off your own community and disrupt your own sense of belonging. I don't know if that's really worth it. I think that that's why we're in a loneliness epidemic in part.
Mm.
And we have had this overabsorption of boundaries to the extent that we're not necessarily creating connection and creating within us an opportunity to grieve the families that we wish we had and to step into a different way of organizing around our families. When we do the grieving process and we grieve the family we wish we had, that parent that could have said, I love you, and maybe not have been so distant and cold in the ways that they needed to self preserve or the ways that they were socialized to be, but we needed that touch, that tenderness, and we never got it. We need to grieve that that's not the parent we have. Instead, there is a true version of the parent that's there, which is the parent that they themselves didn't receive love and affection. So they never even learned what that can look like. What they received was a stoic parent that was never really holding of them. Like there weren't hugs, there weren't I love you. Many times that parent may have stonewalled even, and that all of that was a part of their lived experience. So what they had to offer was a version of that. And we can see them in their full humanness and in the totality of who they are. And the fact that these histories lived within them, and that also contributed to the fact that they couldn't show up for your needs in the ways that you needed. And when we are able to do that, if I radically accept the family that's in front of me, that diminishes my suffering. And I know that there's a lot of studies that, you know, the DBT folks have actually enacted around radical acceptance and a lot of the DBT mechanisms to help us understand that when you say, I radically accept this as it is, it diminishes your level of suffering. But when you actually say, no, I must change and I must and this should and the must haves, that actually increases our stress levels and deepens our suffering, which is a lot of what we're trying to diminish and into this next stage of our lives.
Going through that radical acceptance, which is generally part of acceptance and commitment therapy, for the therapists that are out there that are listening, um, going through that radical acceptance, I can say for myself personally, has been a huge shift in my life with my own parents in terms of those early childhood experiences that particularly that one experience that I had, but that was also layered because of their responses to that trauma, which was part of the layer of all the other traumas that they had been through since really early on in their lives, um, made it difficult for them to parent. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they got shit going on, you know? I mean, they're like,
Mm-hmm.
they are really going through a bit of suffering. And so some of the stonewalling, some of the coldness, some of the distance was there, um,
Mm-hmm.
during
Yeah.
periods of my life. And more recently, I used that radical acceptance of and the grieving of the parents that I did not have. And while, you know, the direction that this went in isn't going to be everyone's story. My story is it with recently after reading your book, I actually at 50 years old, I decided I'm going to have an even deeper layer of grace with my parents, and
Mm.
I'm going to love them in the ways that I wanted to be loved. I will say that from that, we have been able to come, even in the more recent days leading up into meeting you today, to such deep healing between us. And that's a happy ending story. I know that's not everyone's story, but it can
Mhm.
be someone else's story. And it
Yeah.
took more strength than I think I've ever had to use through all the healing processes I've been through in terms of PTSD and grief and all that. The thing that I think took the most strength was for me to turn around and give as much grace and love to my parents as I could give.
Yeah.
And that is
Oh,
the thing that really led to beautiful relationships
yeah.
between my mom and myself and my dad and myself that I wasn't able to have before, and they're not gonna be here
Mhm.
forever. So if anything happened today with any of us as it can, I can say that I'm at peace, and that is
Mhm.
because of what you shared. And so I really thank you for that because I now feel more seen, more embraced. And I think I will begin to feel more celebrated by my parents, but certainly more seen and embraced, which I define as the three layers of belonging: seen, embraced, celebrated. My parents understand me more, in other words, and I feel that interpsychic connection with them at a deeper level than I ever have before. And it feels like it's more stable now. It's not like hit or miss depending on what's happening with their nervous systems. And I think that's because the love that I was giving back to them has started to heal their own nervous systems, not in a way that, like, I'm gonna come save you, but in a way of, I don't want to continue to be activated by you. So I'm going to choose to do things to calm myself and bring my baseline um, activation, nervous system activation. I'm going to bring it way down before I interact with you. And I'm going to commit to staying in that space instead of jumping to the cognitions that pop up when I'm around them, like, "Oh, you're not listening to me. You don't hear me. You don't understand me." Those old narratives that can come up, and seeing them and putting the focus on what's activating for them, that avoidance kind of thing that you were talking about that can happen with baby boomers and really with anybody who has that flee response when they go, "I don't know what you're talking about. What are you talking about?" I've heard parents say, to your point about not learning the coping skills, I've heard parents say, "What do you want me to do?" Like, that is
Mhm.
their way of saying, "I haven't learned the coping skills." I think
Wow.
we hear it as, "I'm not gonna do anything and you need to solve this for me." But what they're actually saying is, "I genuinely don't know what to do. I haven't learned this coping skill, and so
Mm.
we're going to
Wow.
flee and avoid in this
Mhm.
moment." And so that is how I have found that healing from intergenerational trauma actually can create more belonging, whether that is uh, literally with the people in your lives who have contributed to the pain that you might experience, or if it's literally just feeling like you belong back to yourself again in terms
Mhm.
of, I belong back in my body. My body and I have now developed a relationship with one another where my
Wow.
nervous system and I can communicate with one another. We're not at the mercy of each other anymore. My nervous system's not at the mercy of my, um, you know, y- yelling, which just adds to the activation. And I'm not at the mercy of my nervous system getting activated because we are communicating with one another. At the very least, that is what I have found um, to be symbiotic between belonging and intergenerational trauma. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the
Wow.
connection between belonging and intergenerational trauma.
I'm, like, taking it all in because it's, like, beautifully overwhelming. Um, And it's so humbling and it's really affirming to hear your words. So I thank you for them. I thank you for just helping me to see the impact that this work could have outside of my bubble, right? Like sometimes you write a book you're really passionate about, you really want to help, and you don't really know if it's working. You're just kind of in this
It's working,
silo.
sis, it's working. It's working.
That it just brought me chills, and I'm just so humbled. So thank you for that. And I agree. They're so synergistic that they can't even be extracted from one another.
Mm.
Because a lot of what I desired was for us to have uh, a way in which we can reconnect back to our roots in a way that felt healthy rather than feeling the weight and only the weight. We can feel the weight and we can learn how to reconcile with the weight while inviting in connection, which is, within the work itself, I talk about how forgiveness itself is not a requisite to healing and generational healing, but how I have seen that many people have seen that, especially forgiveness of self, like how I've showed up as my unhealed self and the version of me that just didn't know that I was wounded. I think that that's a really important aspect of the healing, like the self forgiveness. Sometimes, perhaps not even forgiveness of others, but at the very least, bringing it back to that compassion, of that understanding. And I find it so fascinating how one of the pillars of belonging, according to your theory and model, is understanding. Because my father has this statement that he's, mentioned to us since we were little. I think it's a little bit shady, to be honest. I think he's like, throwing shade, but also being really loving and saying it. But he says, I seek to understand your mother more than I seek to love her. And
Mm.
they've been in this like mutuality of trying to understand each other through all the eras of life. Right now, they're, um, above 65, both of them, in her 70s. And so I think that there's a lot of regression that's happening,
Mhm.
emotional regression for them, and they're very tender. They're like babies, and it's like because they have like they don't have the level of potency of defenses as they did before, and they can get so tender. I find it that they're even trying to learn each other right now.
Mm.
After many decades of being together, of not understanding each other, going back to understanding. And I think that that has forged such a deep connection between them, such a deep sense of this is my human, this is my person, this is where I belong. That I think is really an explanation, like a very like real present day reflection of how decades of understanding can forge that sense of belonging. When it comes to, belonging, and generational healing, we all were human. It is a part of our nature to want to belong. So when we start forging these like very abrupt and hard set disconnections by way of hyper boundaried, kind of like approaches to the people in our lives, it can make it so that, to be frank, I think that generational healing can feel a lot harder because, like I mentioned in the book, we have to find people who we can co-heal with.
Mhm.
If it's not possible to be able to co-heal with the people that are directly connected to us in our lineage, at the very least find people in your proximity. One of my close friends from grad school is my one of my co-healers. Um, and I've known her for 10 years, and for probably all those 10 years we've been doing some good work. I have people in my life who we will talk about how their parents have ways in which their coping mechanisms, their very, boomer centered coping mechanisms can feel hurtful and even invalidating, and even like how they can feel unseen as a result. And so a lot of that dialogue, that intergenerational discrepancies of how we cope and also the discrepancies of what's happened make it so that people feel unseen. So what is some of the antidote? It's leaning into those false and true family approaches, I wanted to add, which I did, a script inside of the book to say, this can be an entry point into a conversation that can be a bit healthier and less invalidating for you so that you and that person can stay in the conversation and feel like you've made some sort of a healthy transition from the depths of the pain. I know that it can be hard to have these conversations. Most of us don't have a script. So why don't we use this one? We know, through studies and we know through our understandings of mental health, when we stay focused on the emotion rather than focused on the context of what's happening in the moment, there is a forging of deeper connection versus what is likely to happen, which is a very tit for tat. You said this, you did this, and we just go back and forth. But if we situate, our experience on this is the emotion that I'm carrying right now in reference to feeling deeper disconnection from you, and I love to be in connection. That is a more gratifying kind of conversation, but also one that leaves the people in a position of greater motivation towards being on the same page and having mutual goals. So, it's nuanced and it's complex, and families come with a variable histories. But what I have found is that within those histories, as complicated as they might be, there is opportunity. There's always opportunity for even what I call like a microscopic form of healing. In the book, I referenced to my mother's propensity to keep things. And just the other day, she picked up a number of things from the thrift store. She's a big thrifter. And I pick her up and I'm like, Mom, what is all this? um, and so I could see my defenses kicking up. So I infused humor. And, I saw that she picked up a number of things, and supposedly they were to donate to someone whose home had burned down. And, it comes from a place of kindness, but it creates burdens that
Mm,
we as her family have to engage in and feel stressed about because there is a very high chance that probably two or three items will go to that family and the rest will find its way into our home. So,
mm,
I have to understand that there's been microscopic change in healing where I've heard my mother say things like, you know what, I could probably buy less and I can honor that and sit with the fact that that is still a version of healing. And the fact that just the other day she still went to buy things and I can live in that truth, in the
mhm,
true family that is there and the
mhm,
one that I would love to maintain connection with for whatever length of time I still have them for.
mhm. It reminds me of bicultural identity integration, where it's, I'm gonna take the parts that work for me, and I'm going to leave the parts that don't. And you have agency over that, having that,
Mm,
empowering yourself to
yes.
choose the part of the relationships and focus on the part of the relationships that are working for you, and having some
Hmm.
boundaries, or not engaging in the parts that don't. So, final question that
Hmm.
everyone is asked here, and I can't wait to hear your answers. What does belonging mean to you, Dr. Muriel?
Belonging to me, um, it means having a sense of honest self inquiry into ourselves to really have a deeper understanding of how we wish to belong. And then proceeding to engage in all facets of our lives to create the sense of belonging that we desire and need. I know that for me, it matters to me to surround myself around people um, who share the element of humility and kindness that I like to embody. That is one of the generational gifts that's passed down through my family, beyond the burdens. And that when I engage with people such as yourself, Mona, and people that I can feel like there's a lot of mutuality and personality synergy here that I feel an instant sense of this is community for me. So for me, it's, about really going deep into ourselves and thinking what feels like community, what feels like it's true, authentic synergistic ways in which I can feel like I belong here and I don't have to force it. So I think it starts from places like that, which the self inquiry is a part of the healing. So the healing has to
Mm.
be a part of it too.
I really appreciate how, Meryl, how you start with belonging in terms of going within yourself.
Mhm.
I love this conversation with you, and I'm so honored to have had you here today. Thank you so, so much. I feel like we have our own synergistic, and I feel like we have our own synergistic connection that was very instant, like you said, and I'm honored that you received that. So much love to you,
Mhm.
and thank you again.
Much love back. Thank you so much for having me.